Hi everyone. Okay, so first I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Brooke Fuhrmann. This is my second semester here at RUS. I am in Purple Semester. I'm one of the Purple Semester fundraising chairs. I'm also the Feline Foster and Intake Coordinator for PAWS. I graduated from Penn State University Berks campus in May of last year. I have one dog, 4 cats, a gecko, and a fish. My dog and 1 cat are on the island. That dog up there is Finn, that's my dog. And my cat is a PAWS alum, Peridot. I formerly worked at an animal shelter. I was there for about 2 years. And then after that I worked for a Banfield pet hospital. I've also worked in a boarding facility, a gourmet salon, and I volunteered with a no-kill cat rescue in college. This is the shelter that I worked at. It's called the Animal Rescue League of Berks County. It was located in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It's about an hour away from Philadelphia, about 2 hours away from New York City. We are an open admission shelter and we are the SPCA for Berks County. So we take in any animal, we don't turn people away. Unfortunately, that does mean we're not a no-kill shelter, so we did have to euthanize from time to time. And these are just some of the animals that I've worked with throughout my time at the shelter. As you can see, we took in everything. We took in large animals, small animals, reptiles, exotics. We took in wildlife, but we would have to transfer it to a wildlife center. So my favorite was the screech owl up at the top that came in when he was found sitting in the middle of the road in the middle of the day. A couple of these animals I've adopted, namely the orange cat at the bottom. He was my bottle baby, and now he's an adult. The white cat right above him, that's my cat Fluff. And the gecko, his name is Ultron. But we've worked with all sorts of animals at the shelter. So basically what I want to talk about is the things I've learned in an animal shelter. I think it's important for us as vet students to understand the world of working in an animal shelter. Even if you're just a small animal practitioner, you're still going to come in contact with shelter animals. Either your clients are going to rescue them or you might have to work with local shelters. And same goes for large animal. We did take in horses, donkeys, cows, goats, all sorts of things. So it's important to understand the basic aspects of working in a shelter. The very first thing that I learned working in a shelter was that not everyone surrendering their pet is a bad person. There's a common misconception that people don't surrender their pets for good reasons. And a lot of the time that is true. We did have several pets that were surrendered for just absolutely horrible reasons, like, oh, I'm sick of them, I didn't expect them to live this long, they're old, stuff like that, but that wasn't always the case. And a lot of the public had the misconception that if people were surrendering their animals, they haven't done everything they could, but that's what shelters are here for. The cat that's pictured there is named Izzy. He was about a 10-year-old male. He was surrendered to the shelter actually after his owner passed away from cancer. She was 32 years old, and her husband had the 4 cats. And he just couldn't handle them. They had a flea infestation that he couldn't get under control. He was working all the time to try to avoid the medical bills, and he surrendered them to the shelter, and they all ended up getting adopted. He was actually my foster. He was in the shelter for about a year, and he was the sweetest cat. I mean, you could tell he was well taken care of. It wasn't something where the people wanted to surrender him, but they just really didn't have any other options. I'm sorry about all the noise. The second thing I learned is that not everyone adopting is a good pet owner. We had several instances where people adopted animals and did not take proper care of them, but since we were a public shelter, we couldn't really have a lot of stipulations for our adopters. The only requirements we had for our adopters was they either had to own their home or they needed to have their landlord's approval on their adoption application, and then they had to have no prior convictions of animal cruelty. But Pennsylvania is a state with not a ton of laws against animal cruelty. Basically, all your animal needs is food, water, and shelter can be anything as much as having a vehicle for the dog to lay under if it rains. So unfortunately, there were people who took absolutely horrible care of their animals, and there was not much we could do about it. The dog that's pictured here is named Lyric. He was one of my favorite animals that has ever come into the shelter. He was a Mastiff mix, about 6 years old. He had been in the shelter for about, I'd say 6 months, and he was our go-to dog for events because he was so friendly, he was good with kids, he was good with other animals. he was the perfect dog, and he ended up getting adopted one day after I left work, and one of my coworkers texted me to let me know he was adopted. And then I came in the next morning, and I looked on the computer to see who adopted him, and his status was showing as euthanized. So I asked what had happened, and it turns out that the woman who adopted him, I guess she kind of gave them a very bad feeling about what was going on, and she returned him 2 hours later, saying that he attacked another dog and she couldn't handle him and that he was aggressive. And none of this was stuff that we saw in the shelter, but because she said it, they took her word for it, and he was euthanized. And this is a dog that, did nothing wrong the whole time he was at the shelter. And unfortunately, that's the sad fact of it, is that sometimes dogs get into the hands of bad people, and same with cats. We have plenty of animals that ended up returned to the shelter because they just went to an unfit home. The third, and probably one of the most important things that I've learned, is that euthanasia is absolutely not the worst outcome for an animal. Euthanasia is often the nicest option, and a lot of the cases that I saw in the shelter were, the animals were in absolute terrible condition. We had cruelty cases where the animals had to be kept for a certain amount of time until the court case. And in those cases, unfortunately, the nicest thing we could do for them was euthanize them, because they were either too unfriendly, too unhealthy to be rehabilitated, that there was nothing more we could do. And the unfortunate fact is that sometimes the shelter is the nicest place those animals ever see. The dog this pictured is named Damien, and he was actually a dog that I rescued off of Facebook. He was posted on a Facebook Craigslist group for free, and I was on all of those pages, and I would pose as just an adopter looking to adopt animals, and oftentimes I would take them into the shelter if I had the suspicion that they were being mistreated or had a suspicion they would go into dog fighting. One of the big issues in the area that I lived in was that we had a city called Reading. The biggest issue with it was dogfighting and cockfighting. So we had several cases where we busted dogfighting rings or backyard breeder type of deals where they were breeding American bullies, pit bulls, Staffordshires, and selling them into dogfighting. And he was a dog that was given up by his owner when he moved into an apartment where he couldn't have pets. And unfortunately, the person who took the dog did not take good care of him. When I saw his picture posted on the Facebook page, he was absolutely emaciated. He was missing most of his fur on his back end. And you could see that he was being kept in a basement, and he had a chain tied to his neck. So I messaged the person, I said, I want to adopt the dog. I've had bully breeds my whole life, and the guy told me that he was a pit bull. Come to find out, when I picked the dog up, he's actually a Presa Canario, and they are an interesting breed. They are very particular about who they trust, and the person who had rescued the dog, didn't take very good care of him, and the owner ended up finding out, and the owner was the one who posted him on Facebook, and he just needed to get him out as soon as possible. So I went in, I adopted the dog, and I told the owner, I'm taking him to a shelter, but I'm trying to avoid this from happening again. And actually, when we got him in for his behavioral evaluation, he failed, even though when he was with me, he was great. I didn't notice anything, but when they did the SAFER evaluation, which is one of the best and most widely recognized behavioral evaluations used in shelters, they found that he had some resource guarding with toys and some food aggression that they felt was unsafe to put him in a home with kids. But he actually ended up going to a rescue with a girl who used to work at the shelter. She moved to Tennessee. She had him for a good 6 months. Fortunately, he ended up having cancer and had to be euthanized because he got to the point where he was just losing weight and his behavior was changing. But I brought him into the shelter understanding that even if he ended up euthanized, it was not the worst possible thing that could happen, that he had already kind of seen the worst, and it wouldn't have surprised me if he would have ended up in dogfighting due to the fact that he was pretty dog aggressive and he was a larger breed. But that's something that a lot of the public doesn't understand. They will call you a killer and stuff like that, but honestly, sometimes it is the best thing you can do. The fourth thing I learned is that work never ends. You bring everything home with you, between the burden of work, the emotional burden, the joy, and animals. I fostered about 25 cats while I worked at the shelter, through the shelter, and I fostered probably another 100 or so privately that I had either found or was given, and raised them and then adopted them out privately to good homes. And this foster is named Walter White. He was brought into the shelter at about 5 weeks old. He was blind in one eye and completely deaf. And I was actually out of work for surgery at the time, but it was the day before my surgery, and I took him home, and I had 9 cats in the house at the time, 6 of which were fosters. 7 were fosters, only 2 were actually mine. But it's the kind of thing where you go home and you go on Facebook pages, you're looking for animals, you're looking for people mistreating their pets. It's something that affects you so deeply working in a shelter that it changes who you are completely. I found myself trying to educate people about spaying and neutering, vaccinating their pets, all sorts of stuff outside of work. And when I went home, it was, okay, I've been cleaning cat cages all day and adopting out cats. Now I'm gonna go clean all my fosters' litter boxes and try to find them homes. And it's something that's exhausting, but definitely worth it. The 5th thing that I learned is the most common phrase you're going to hear working in a shelter is, I don't know how you do it. The first few times I heard it, I almost took it as a compliment. Like, people were complimenting my strength, stuff like that, for working in the shelter. And as I worked there longer and started to hear it about 5 to 6 times a day, I started to get angrier and angrier because I could start to pick up on the undertones that when people were saying, I don't know how you do it, they were referring to the fact that I have to euthanize animals, and they don't understand how I can euthanize an animal or how I can sit there and see an animal in this poor condition and still go to work and still be okay and not break down. But it's not that these things don't bother me, it's that you learn to cope with them and you learn how to work through it and keep doing your job, because at the end of the day, you're saving lives. And regardless of all the bad things that I've had to do working in the shelter and all the horrible things I've seen, the good has always outweighed the bad. And I told myself that when a day came where the bad situations outweighed the good, that I would leave the shelter. And there was a day when that came, and I left and I went to Banfield and worked there until I came here. But it starts to bother you. And I just wanted to quick say the cat that's pictured here is named Skylar White. She's not really related to this slide. I just needed to put an animal in, and she's really adorable. The 6th thing I learned is another important thing. It's important to take the extra time with every animal that you see, because oftentimes you're going to be the only compassion and love that they ever get. We had so many animals that came in from either cruelty cases or abandonment cases where they've never known a loving home, and the shelter is the best place they've ever experienced, because they have a roof over their head, they get fed twice a day, they have water, they have a bed, they have people who care about them, regardless of if they're aggressive or not. I can remember one case in particular where we surrendered, I want to say it was about 6 dogs that were actually alive, and probably another 13 that were dead. And all 6 of the dogs ended up eventually euthanized after the court case because they were so incredibly aggressive. And one of them actually tried to attack me, and that was my first day in the dog kennels. So that was not how I wanted to start it off, but I understood that it wasn't their fault that they were that way. They were so starved that they had to fight for their food. That was the only way they would eat. And they didn't understand that being in a shelter, they wouldn't have to worry about getting food anymore. And ultimately, sometimes you're the best thing that ever happens to them. The cat that's pictured here is named Mysterious. He was the sibling to the orange kitten that I pictured earlier. There were 5 of them, and 4 of them died. The orange one was the only one to survive. And I had them since they were about a week old. As you can see, his eyes are still closed here. And I bottle fed them. They ended up having some sort of GI issue that we couldn't get resolved, and